This kind in the late 1980s in the cocoa regions of Peru's upper Halugia Valley resembled the agricultural loss and human devastation that accompanied the forced production of opium in parts of China in the 1930s. The only difference is that in the case of China, demand was essentially a domestic phenomenon. But there is no doubt that acres and acres, hectares of land in China have been cut down so people can grow opium, basically, in slave-like conditions. Many people in Colombia and Central American countries have been forced to grow cocoa plants for the massive markets that have appeared around the world. And these markets have appeared in some cases because of prohibition, because the more harsh the laws and the more difficult at times to get supply, the more concentrated the drugs become. And so anyway, the corruption and just ecological devastation are two things that I think you can't put numbers on. And while it's not as apparent here in Canada, it certainly is around the world. This one's pretty obvious. Government expenditures on law enforcement, prisons, and courts could be reduced. Courts would not be as backlogged, prisons would be less crowded, and the police could concentrate resources on traditional crimes such as rape, murder, and robbery. These changes might help promote respect for law and order. Unfortunately, here in Canada, we are definitely going the opposite direction in terms of cutting down our expenditures. The Conservative government's putting more money into building prisons and all sorts of new laws. And so if our government has its way, we would be looking at a new industry of prisons, really getting people employed in northern parts of the country. I've seen recent stories, and it's just hit Can West in the last week or so, this whole series of articles promoting prisons as a good way to stimulate the economy. Individuals would be directly responsible for their own use or non-use of drugs. More resources and public attention could be devoted to education, treatment, maintenance, and rehabilitation. Again, statistically, our governments are spending a fraction of their money on the actual consequences of drug use, and it's something that if our resources were channeled towards healthcare, and we gave people the responsibility and the means to do what they wanted, we would not only live in a more humane and safer world, but a much more efficient and healthier planet as well, for sure. Customers would have access to the legal system, protect themselves against fraud and negligence on the part of the producer. Producers would no longer have to resort to violence to enforce contracts and ensure payments. Sales territories would be made by voluntary agreement rather than by violence. And so there's there. Yeah, I know I'm flashing through the pictures. They're all up online, and but this one here gives you an idea. Again, there's cocaine traffic, and that's like ephedra, I think another drug, and then marijuana and meth traffic, and it kind of shows you where these various drugs will come in. Now, all these places, unfortunately, the lines are probably changing. There's so much violence happening down in Mexico over this turf, and who has access to the border lines, and but there's several different cartels lined up here that are competing for resources and stuff. But if there is a problem, even outside of dealing with the cartels, where violence is the way that people figure out who's working in what neighborhood, there's very few recourses if, again, there's a liability issue or otherwise. And so what you have here in Canada is not so much turf wars where, like in the Lower Mainland, people are being shot because somebody's lost some customer base because they're on the different block. Although at a street level, people do get beat up if they appear suddenly to start dealing drugs in a place someone else normally does. But the people that are being killed over there are quite often being killed out of drug debts, where they are not, for one reason or another, able to make up or pay for the money that they owe people. And in order to make an example out of the individual who hasn't come up with their money, unfortunately, the gangs resort very quickly to violence to make it known that they're not going to tolerate people not coming up with their money. And so, you know, the violence that is apparent in our society because of the drug trade would be dramatically reduced, if not completely eliminated. Because, you know, people that are using, you know, heroin and you know, in particular, and marijuana to be sure, are not violent when they're under the influence of these drugs, quite the opposite. And the 10th point, many of the products that have been prohibited have legitimate uses and were important products in the development of modern civilization. Legalization would allow for their use in these and other areas and would promote general economic development. And so, fortunately, there are many economists such as Mark Thornton and now police officers that are considering the legalization of drugs to be the correct route to go. Unfortunately, it's not happening as quickly or in the right direction under this conservative government. Here in Victoria, on I guess a completely different angle, the prohibition of drugs has created an obvious problem with infections from people using needles and getting hepatitis C and AIDS and other infectious diseases. They shut down the safe injection drug site here in Victoria a couple of years ago. Now there's a mobile needle exchange. There's certain areas in the downtown that's not even allowed to go, and it's contributing to greater health problems. And it's something that there's a coalition of people, the Harm Reduction Network, I think they're called, who on April 15th they're going to be petitioning City Hall to get a safe injection drug site and at the very least a needle exchange here in Victoria, because they don't even have that now. And it's something that I think those of us that love cannabis and are fighting to legalize it just need to recognize that prohibition as a whole is wrong, and we need to argue against it. We can't just tell the cops to go get the other guys up the street for their drug of choice. We need to talk people out of enforcing these laws, period, and going towards, you know, regulatory models and proper education and healthy patterns of drug use and healthy societies, instead of prohibiting people and condemning them for using drugs that we may not personally agree with. So thanks again everybody for coming. Again, this is to me the crux of what we're working against, and we work in our own corner to legalize pot often, but these greater issues can't be ignored. So thanks everybody for coming out. I guess next week it's pot and politics, and we'll take it from there. Thanks for coming out. Have a great day. Thanks.